Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the USCC webinar series, Doing Impactful Circular Economy Research. It is actually the second season of these webinars, so we started last spring and now we continue with our fall season. My name is Ida Parkkinen and I'll be your host for today's session. I represent the Research Center for Sustainable Circular Economy, which we call USCC. And the purpose of our webinar series is to really delve into the various aspects of circular economy research, share insights from various experts, and foster discussions that help us drive impactful change in our communities and organizations. We're really excited to have you with us as we explore the fifth topic in our series, which is behavioral study of plastic waste management. And this presentation is based on a collaborative research project with insights presented from both a published report and a draft academic paper, which is currently in development for journal submission. And we are so proud to have Professor Natalia Yakovleva from the KEDGE Business School, France, as our speaker. She will tell more details about the current project and the paper development. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions during the presentation. We will have time for a Q&A session and also all the discussions at the end. Please ensure that your microphone is muted to avoid any background noise. We will be recording the webinar. And this recording will be made available for later viewing. You can follow all the previous webinar recordings on our CECE YouTube channel. But now let's get started. It is my joy to welcome Professor Yakovleva. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ita. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to talk about this project and also our ongoing paper. I must acknowledge my colleague, Professor Diego Vasquez-Brust from the University of Portsmouth, who led a project called Plasticity, funded by Interact 2Cs and later by the European Development Fund. And Diego invited me into the project to analyze, qualitatively analyze the interviews that was conducted within the study, which I'm going to explain to you today what the study is about. So first, I'm going to talk about backgrounds into methods, and then one by one, I will look into attitudes to recycling, subjective norms, knowledge and resources, and these are behavioral factors of taken from the framework developed by Asian, and also institutional factors like pressures, barriers, enablers, and that are institutional factors that influence recycling behavior. And then we'll continue with recommendations and concluding remarks. The interesting part of this study, which was part of the larger research project funded by the European Union, was to look into 4 countries, Belgium, France, Netherlands, and the UK. So it's interesting to see comparatively between these 4 locations. So the purpose of the entire project was to look at reducing the use of virgin plastics and improve plastic recycling in Europe. And it is acknowledged that it is a multi-layered challenge. And at the time, there was about 30% of plastic was recycled in Europe. I believe it is increasing. And the challenge is how to change the behavior of individual households, but also of various organizations and companies themselves, right? So the study focused on examining behavioral and institutional factors that influence recycling behavior. And as I mentioned, it was a part of the larger project called Plasticity, funded by Interact 2 Cs and the European Regional Development Fund. So the study focused on 8 different actors in all these 4 locations. So 8 actors were put together in a sort of supply chain of plastics, starting with logistics companies, non-governmental organizations, plastics manufacturers, policymakers, product makers, and designers that use plastics as an element of the product or packaging, recycling companies, waste management companies that collect and sort waste, and waste owners or waste producers. So the study was focusing on cities. So very interesting focus, not only on countries, but on cities and looking at the urban environment as well. So the 4 cities were chosen: Ghent in Belgium, Douai in France, The Hague in the Netherlands, and the Southend-on-Sea in the United Kingdom. And the conceptual framework used in this study was a theory of perceived behavioral control, which is developed by Eisen, and examined various waste management practices. And as I mentioned, it was theory of perceived behavioral control and the institutional factors such as pressures, barriers, and enablers. So behavioral control concepts would be attitude, subjective norms, and knowledge. So this is the outlook at the conceptual framework, how to capture the behavior of plastic recycling and what influences the behavior. So looking at this framework, we see that in the middle we have the 2 main elements. It's the behavior, the actual behavior, the actual action of recycling. And we are focusing here on organizations, not on individuals such as households or me and you doing that at home, but we are focusing on organizations, right, mentioned before, like logistic companies, non-governmental organizations, and so forth. And Eisen actually has proposed an idea which has been tested empirically, that behavior and intention to recycle, there is well, it's not the same thing, right? So you might have an intention to recycle, but that actually might not materialize. So there is a gap between intention and behavior, which is very well acknowledged. And it's also acknowledged, it comes from the psychology, and it's also very well acknowledged in environmental consumption area as well. So we do know that there is a gap, but what influences the intention? Because the intention is one of the most significant factors that influence behavior. So what underlies the intention? So Eisen suggests that there are behavioral factors such as attitudes towards certain activities. So in this case, recycling. And we are looking at managers, so it's personal and corporate attitudes. And also we have subjective norms. So subjective norms, what are they? They are perceived social pressures to perform or not to perform a behavior. So these are norms within the community or within the surrounding environment, or, that surrounds managers and organizations as well. And also perceived behavioral controls. These are interesting things. So although you might have a positive attitude to recycle, you might have a community support and expectations that you should recycle. But behavioral controls, these are knowledge and resources available to you to be able to act. So resources for recycling, that would be organizational resources related to plastic recycling, such as financial, human, equipment, technical, infrastructure, facilities. All these are resources available to you that will incentivize you to act. So on the other hand, these are on the left side, we have behavioral controls that comes from psychology, and on the right side, we have institutional factors, because there is literature that actually says we have certain factors that directly influence behavior. These are pressures, barriers, and enablers, right? So pressures that could be market pressures, regulatory pressures that push the organizations to implement best practices in recycling, and enablers. These could be potential solutions introduced or implemented. If they are introduced or implemented, they may motivate organizations towards plastic recycling. And barriers, of course, it's understandable, something that prevents you from acting. So by adopting this framework, a questionnaire was developed to ask managers in the plastics supply chain around attitudes, norms, resources, pressures, barriers, and enablers to understand how these elements influence their recycling behavior. So the study was quite widespread. So, overall, 87 interviews across 4 regions were collected. So interviews were conducted in the 4 locations in Belgium, France, Netherlands, and the UK. And more or less same number of actors were interviewed in each location, from 18 to 27 per each city. And the researchers tried to capture the entire supply chain as much as possible, but there were gaps because not all countries, for instance, have actual plastics manufacturers, it seems. And the interviews were conducted in Dutch, English, French, and later transcribed and translated using Sonic's AI software into English. And then I was invited to look into the interviews to look and analyze the text. So I specialize in qualitative research. So what I did, I analyzed the interviews using NVivo software, did the coding, and initially, and this is presented also in the report published, I looked at multi-case study approach, where you develop individual cases for like in this case, there would be countries and cities. So first case study would begin, second France, and third Netherlands, and the last one in the UK, and then conduct cross-case comparison. So I will present to you some of the outcomes of this research that looked at the factors influencing recycling behavior. So starting with attitudes, do companies in plastic supply chain actually have a positive attitude toward recycling? And yes, of course, we find that overall, there is a very positive attitude towards recycling in the plastic supply chain. And this is an interesting thing. Although companies do have a positive attitude, but in reality, we see the statistics that only 30% of plastics is recycled. So what happens in between from the attitudes towards actual outcome? And it seems that there are different levels of proficiency in recycling. And I found 3 categories, which I labeled novice, competent, and expert. And it seems that those who are experts, they are specialists in plastic manufacturing or plastics recycling itself. And having experts is very good for sharing knowledge and learning within the supply chain. So these companies, of course, recycling and plastics is a core of their mission. A lot of these organizations are in pursuit of circular economy principles. They have extensive technological and organizational knowledge, as well as skills, resources for recycling. And they are important because they contribute to training and guidance on recycling and share this practice in the supply chain. Often, these are larger companies, of course, but also another level that we have competent those companies, organizations that have experience of recycling for several years. So they have tried and tested recycling, and it's part of their corporate policy. They acknowledge circular economy in their corporate policy, and they already have proven expertise in recycling. And so these companies can also, we find that these are larger companies, but they also can benefit from training and further guidance and support. And then finally, we have another the group that is less proficient. These are novice organizations. They have just started recently recycling, or they are doing it on a limited scale. And organizations are only starting to shape their policy on recycling. Their scope of recycling is limited, and organizations might have constraints or internal barriers that they need to overcome. And this group is the one that would benefit the most from training and support on plastic recycling. And we see that mostly these are at the later stages of supply chain, where plastics is not really core of their organizational policies or strategies. These are businesses that produce plastic waste, and they are often could be small companies, like small shops, small organizations. So attitude is positive, but then supporting that knowledge is different. So looking at what are origins of the attitudes, so what contributes to forming positive attitudes towards recycling. And here I just want to show a little bit of a comparison between neighboring countries, Belgium and France. And we do see that there are external sources that form organizational attitudes, such as regulation and industry practice, stakeholder exposure, but also place-based type of contextual norms that supply some additional input into forming the attitudes, but also internal as well, such as colleagues, managers, expertise, evolution of corporate environment, but also interestingly, which have been preceding the plastics concerns within the European Union, it's environmental strategies that are in place and the climate change strategies that are in place that also reinforce the attitudes towards plastic recycling. So the same, very, very similar in Netherlands and the UK, with some differences in maybe national strategies, but or maybe municipal type of strategies that exist, place-based policies, but very much similar type of origins for the corporate attitudes. Now, so subjective norms. So these are norms, pressures from maybe the environment that organizations find themselves in, and where those subjective norms and pressures come from. So we looked at these categories as sources of social norms, like policymakers, insiders such as employees, outsiders, so this could be consumers, peers, other businesses, and neighbors like local community, general public. And we do see that, yes, all of those different types of sources, they do influence the actors, but actually what is interesting, more or less similar type of pressures they experience, all the countries, but it seems that in Netherlands, employees are most active about plastic recycling, as opposed to UK, France, and Belgium, which is interesting. So across all regions, local policymakers such as municipal councils have the strongest influence on actors in plastic supply chain, because a lot of the municipalities, they are responsible for waste collection, they are responsible for promoting waste strategies. So it's very, very visible type of the policy influence on especially local businesses. And I had come up with some sort of a little type of analysis strategy where I tried to look and range across the different types of um, sources of pressure, and I have much more, the international community, European community, national government, municipal council, local community, and so forth, how much they influence different types of actors within the supply chain. So one circle is they agree there is a source of pressure, two is they strongly agree, and three absolutely agree because majority of them say so. And so visually you can see where the most pressures experience is coming from, and you can see that waste owners, they experience a lot of pressure from all different types of sources. Right. Okay. So looking at the knowledge and resources for recycling. So there are two areas that we can look at, areas of knowledge, such as knowledge on technology, R&D, innovation, regulation, maybe transparency, tools and instruments used, such as LCA, or environmental knowledge, such as eco-design, environmental standards, or employee knowledge and training. And from the areas of resources, we can see, okay, so usually we mention financial, human resources, facilities, technologies, and equipment. So, you know, just moving on to the pressures to recycle. So on one side, we looked at the behavioral pressures, and then we can look at other types of sort of direct and institutional pressures as well. So if you look at the supply chain, there are a lot of pressures on all the actors in the supply chain to act in certain ways. So there are regulatory pressures that usually compliance or bans or like certain directives, but there are also other stakeholder pressures like consumers themselves demand certain products, or competitors are acting in certain ways that shape differently the strategies, or this could be non-governmental stakeholder pressure and so forth, or even sort of environmental standards, which are voluntary, but also pressure organizations to act in certain ways. So we were trying to identify which are these pressures organizations experience. And if we look at the pressures, then I also were able to rank where the sources of pressures come from. Is it European Union? Is it customer? Is it competitor? Is it international pressure? Is it local pressure? Or actually even the pressure for the future, the anticipation of future events would come into place. But it seems to be the most pressures come from customers, right? So a lot of organizations tell us if the customers would require us to use different materials, we will do it, right? So it's a market pressure that companies are waiting for. So there is a huge big role for educating not only the end consumers, but all different types of customers within the supply chain on the value of plastics recycling, so that they put pressure up into the supply chain, so the supply chain reacts under the market pressure. And the second one was most important, it seems to be local pressure. So organizations are very sensitive to their neighbors, whether they are communities, municipalities. They want to be seen as a good neighbor, to be a good in the local environment. So this is also where the municipalities can actually put pressure on organizations in their locality to make pressure so that they perform well on the plastics recycling. Looking at the barriers, there are a lot of barriers, and often what people really say, and managers, they complain that there are not enough funds. So there are certain buyer-supplier relations that are a barrier. Then, of course, lack of facilities or lack of or access to technologies or not sufficient infrastructure for recycling. But also they are saying, okay, maybe there is a lack in management systems or lack of leadership in this area, as well as maybe some barriers within the legislation. So and I was able to identify the priorities between the barriers, turning the words into quantitative analysis. So I was able to actually rate where do they identify the barriers come from when we interviewed those members in the supply chain. So, and in terms of, yeah, so there are slight differences, I might say. So this is a slide that shows the comparison between Belgian responses and the UK responses. Yes, there are slight differences because, of course, we understand that in each country there are certain types of availability of technology or availability of infrastructure, and it does matter. So we need to maintain at the European level certain level of infrastructure provision at a part of the European strategy. So it's not a barrier, right, for organizations to be able to recycle. So this infrastructure development, development of technology and access to technology should be quite, or skills as well, and knowledge should be more or less, pervasive across the countries. And enablers. So what do companies and managers think? Where are the most solutions? What would enable them to act more positively in plastics recycling? And what do they say? Yes, government incentives. So it's a little bit, yeah, if government incentivizes us businesses, we will do it more. If regulation was different then or enforced better, there will be more recycling. But they also want advising and funding maybe for small organizations, access to knowledge, but also they would like to also be part of networking. They understand the power of peer pressure, peer sharing of expertise, of experiences, learning, peer learning is important. So we were able to distill a lot of recommendations how to improve plastic recycling, and we came up with several categories such as technology, supply chain relations, capacity building and awareness, um, looking at the economic instruments as well that could incentivize plastic recycling, some recommendations about improvement of the physical infrastructure, and also certain recommendations about the regulation. So all of this was published within the report, but my academic report has been well received, and I think it's used by the members of the project. But what we really wanted to do, and we put together, we identified what were the most important behavioral factors. So, for instance, attitude, leadership, sources of norms like municipal organizations, local consumers, peers, local community, and certain types of resources and knowledge that is lacking, and certain types of pressures and barriers and enablers that we identified. So this all went into the report. The report was well received, and as I say, it's been used by the members of the project. But what we want as academics as well is to develop a paper out of this so that we can discuss a little bit more on academic level, not on the application level, how but on academic level, how can we shift our thinking around the behavioral and institutional factors, and how this conceptualization can influence wider communities on plastics recycling behavior. So, so I just want to acknowledge all the members in the supply chain in 4 locations who took part in the study, and the researchers who conducted the interviews, and project members who arranged the access, which was not also very easy to access all the supply chain actors. So thank you so much. The report is available. It has been released in July 2022. And here are contacts of myself and Professor Diego Vasquez Bruce, who led the project from the University of Portsmouth. So if you have any questions, and thank you for your attention.